What up, friends? It's getting up there, and today we're going to be reviewing Ritchie's debut solo album, Triple Digits. This is the first solo project by former Injury Reserve member Ritchie. After the unfortunate death of fellow Injury Reserve member Groggs back in 2020, I feel like there was an air of uncertainty surrounding not only the future of the group as a whole, but also the individual careers of Ritchie and Parker. After getting Injury Reserve's very good final album By the Time I Get to Phoenix a year later, it seems that Ritchie and Parker have kind of moved on and have started addressing their solo careers. It's the next chapter for them. They're doing solo projects and even a lot of collaborative projects right now too. However, even with that, they are still working together in some form under the new group name Bystorm, which haven't released an official full-length project yet, but it still shows that they are keeping those creative juices flowing together still. Until we get that full-length project though, they do seem very content in kind of going their separate ways and doing their own thing for now, while intersecting again here and there. On this solo album, we can see Ritchie's Injury Reserve expertise, and also some solo work growing pains on full display. While it's rough around the edges and doesn't really explore all of its concepts thoroughly, it is a pretty good indicator and stepping stone on where Ritchie can go next. After a brief intro, we get to the first track on the record, What You Trying to Do. This track starts the rough and gritty direction that is kind of the theme of the instrumentals of this project as a whole, feeling very reminiscent of By the Time I Get to Phoenix, in addition to something more like Earl Sweatshirt's modern albums. The fuzzy drum loop conveys the sort of heat that this album title suggests, and Ritchie's very laid back and sort of like hazy flows feel right at home here. It's a really good opener overall that sets the tone of the record nicely. Ritchie Valens also goes for that fuzzy tone, but almost in a desperate direction. It's very light compared to the previous song, and I'm really liking the melodic flows on this track too. It meshes well with the synth and vocal samples in the instrumental here. The lyrics are basically calling out fake rappers with fake personas and relationships, which is a very tried and true Injury Reserve theme of basically sticking true to your guns, staying true to yourself, even if it doesn't really win you any awards or favors. I always really like that sort of like do your own thing aspect of the Injury Reserve members. It does kind of come and go, however, which is actually a pretty big problem that I had with By the Time I Get to Phoenix as well, so that part of the instrumental style hasn't really been ironed out yet, but while it's on, it's pretty pleasant. The Keepers is one of the more low-key songs on the project overall, featuring a pretty skeletal beat with these thumping bass tones. The flows are pretty sick, and I like the darker vision that this one has. However, the simpler instrumental overall kind of highlights the problems with this sort of stream of consciousness, instrumental production, and vocal styles. It's not bad, but it also doesn't really have much of a presence to it. It almost feels like an intermission, but the next track is an intermission, so it's kind of like an intermission to an intermission. So I just don't know if this one had enough oomph, I guess. The title track definitely picks things up again though, featuring a pretty unconventional drum pattern in its beat, alongside some pretty like chaotic siren samples too. The vocal samples in this one and the jittery flow from Ritchie I think really express the themes of this song, which are basically Ritchie is just looking out the window at people grinding in the fucking 112-degree Arizona heat, and he's just like, why are you guys doing all that? You should just be staying home chilling. Why does everybody feel like they need to be up and on the go all the time? Just chill. Take it easy, which I get and I appreciate. It's short, but I think it manages to convey its themes pretty well. The instrumental is pretty engaging too, especially compared to some of the more like intermission style tracks on this project, and I think it's a pretty fitting song for the record. The next track, Dizzy, one of the lead singles for the album in fact, is by far the best song on the record, and it has the most presence to it. It feels the most fleshed out, the beat is very jazzy, while also being pretty experimental as well, and I also find the flows on this one to be super engaging too. It actually almost has the cadence of some of the earlier Injury Reserve EPs, which I think is pretty cool. The snappy drum and organ samples also make for a very glitzy vibe to this song. This is very fitting for the lyrics, where Ritchie and Amine are basically calling out the Nepo babies, or just kind of like posers in the scene, who are pushing, 30, 40, and they're kind of still doing childish shit and being a wannabe gangster and stuff like that when they have like families or relationships, and how it's all just kind of corny. Amine was just a very welcome addition to this track as well, adding his own personality while also kind of accentuating Ritchie's as well. I love the dynamic between the two and their different flows and vocal styles. Looping is more of a melancholic song featuring this sort of distorted piano sample alongside these blurry drum loops. The more melodic tone and cadence of the main and background vocals actually remind me a bit of the more sort of melodic and experimental cuts from like an Astro Nautilus record, which I think is a pretty welcome addition here and is a nice shake-up for the record. The off-kilter nature of the track also does a pretty good job in reinforcing Ritchie's sort of chaotic and tumultuous headspace as he's struggling with moving on from Injury Reserve, trying to find his own sound, and how he doesn't want to just remain in stagnancy. How is an interesting track, mostly because it aims for a sort of like drill-inspired instrumental. The vocals are pretty smooth, and I think they do fit the beat on the whole. Granted, the instrumental is kind of repetitive for how simple it is, which is a bit unfortunate. There's some fun wordplay and inflections going on here, but it just doesn't really go anywhere at the end of the day, so it ends up being a little less interesting than I feel like it should have. It's vibey and fits the project, and Yante doesn't really detract from it or anything either. He definitely fits the song, but I feel like overall, just the vibes on this one are a bit too low-key for its own good. The next track, Get a Fade, is probably going to be one of the more controversial ones on this album, but I actually really like it. To me, it's kind of doing what the previous song was doing, but just better. It is vibey for sure, but it's melodic and engaging enough to actually retain my attention. In a way, it almost sounds like an extension of looping in that regard, too. The heavily distorted vocals actually remind me a lot of what Dylan Brady was doing on Injury Reserve's song New Hawaii, which I think is really cool to kind of bring that back in a sense. And the overall, like, distant and melancholic vibe that this song has because of this sort of distorted vocal style, I think is pretty well done. It's super different, which I think is very fresh for Ritchie to do. However, I do think it's one of those sounds where he needs to be careful how he uses it and how much he uses it, because if it was on a longer song than this, I don't know if I would be into it as much. And like, if it was on an album where this was the only sound he was doing, again, I don't think I would be into it as much. But for like some intermission style tracks and stuff like this, I think it works pretty well. The Thing is another pretty great one. It's arguably one of the most like positive and upbeat songs on the project, if you can call it that. That fuzzy production style from earlier comes back once again. It's just all over this beat, and I'm really liking the sort of combination between Ritchie's flows and vocals and the guitar that's in this one too. Quell Chris's vocal style feels perfect over this instrumental, and I'm liking how the overall aesthetic of this track is kind of like you're venting and letting off steam, which I think is pretty cathartic for this record. It's also a bit tongue-in-cheek too, which does help add some personality to the song overall. Unfortunately, I do think the album ends on the weakest note with 5 month or whatever you want to call this one, not counting the outro. I love Parker, but the beat on this one is by far the most boring on the project, and it just doesn't go anywhere. It builds and builds, and it still doesn't go anywhere. Like, what's going on? And despite that, the song builds for too long for how simple it is for most of its runtime. The concept and the lyrics of this track make a lot of sense, talking about the monotony of life and feeling like you're trapped by the system, but expressing that in the instrumental is always a very dangerous game to play. It just feels like a slog, and it's kind of an underwhelming way to end the record, unfortunately. Overall, this was definitely a very interesting look at a post-Injury Reserve Ritchie. There are moments of both familiarity and uncertainty on this project, really showcasing kind of where Ritchie's headspace is at. Quite a few moments on this record do a good job at expressing the hazy and tumultuous time of trying to reinvent yourself and find yourself again. However, the roughness of the project does hurt it, even if it also does give it part of its personality. It's honestly the same problem that I had with By the Time I Get to Phoenix. A lot of the tracks here, while good, just kind of come and go with one verse and a chorus. Now, I'm all for unconventional song structures, but not at the expense of the song sounding unfinished or not establishing enough of a presence. The beats are good on the whole, Ritchie has some pretty fun and varied flows, and even most of the guest artists here fit in quite nicely. However, the album also undercuts all of this with feeling aimless, even on the better songs. Now, you could argue that that was the point of the entire record. The point is that it is very stream of consciousness, it's very rough and jagged around the edges, but when the point makes for a somewhat unremarkable or unmemorable listening experience, I just don't know if it was worth it. Despite all this though, I'm feeling a strong 6 on the debut solo album by Ritchie. Of course, we do still have to talk about album covers on the show, and I like this album cover quite a bit. It really expresses the DIY nature of this album. I think it definitely has that sort of like home recording vibe to it. In a way, the 112 album title on the cover almost reminds me of like an Adult Swim sort of vibe in a sense as well. I don't know if that was totally intentional or not, but I do think it's actually very fitting for the raw nature of this project. The color scheme's pretty nice. It's very low key, chill, hazy, which expresses that again, that 112-degree heat that Ritchie mentions on the record. So overall, I think this album does a pretty good job in expressing the sort of vibe of the project. But those are just my thoughts on this newest album by Ritchie. What did you guys think? Do you think this was a very raw and real experience? Do you think this is kind of the sound that you like from Ritchie? Or were you hoping for something a bit more fleshed out and just maybe a fuller experience, if you will? Let me know. Be sure to like, comment, subscribe, ring the bell, or you'll be stuck in 112-degree heat. And until the next one, farewell.